The dynamic story world must have movement in it. This means that your readers must envision characters and objects in a spatial relationship with one another, even if these relationships are not explicitly spelled out in the text. In other words, even if your reader isn't mapping the story in the way Mary Laura Ryan asked her students to do a couple lessons back, the reader is still implicitly mapping space by placing the characters in an imagined space. This lesson is about how our brains map space. Understanding this process will help us to learn how to create vivid story world spaces for our stories to unfold in. Regions. To keep things in a logical order, I'm going to start from the outside in. Think of a big map. This is how we'll begin. On the largest scale, apart from the entire story world itself, we have regions, which can either be real or fictitious and can vary in size greatly. A region, just as in the real world, will vary depending on the frame the narrator chooses to impose or the one the reader adopts spontaneously if it's not specified by the text. Regions can also have various subregions. You might think of this relationship as something like region, the Midwest, subregion, Michigan, subregion, the Upper Peninsula, and so forth. Depending on the story you're trying to tell, these distinctions may or may not be very important, so don't fret if your story doesn't clearly define all these spatial references. Regions often carry schematic associations of varying specificity. These associations, depending on how specific, can carry immersive power with them, as Mary Laura Ryan explored in her study of literary immersiveness. Generic stereotypical descriptions of the regions like desert town, tropical resort, wealthy suburb, or the like, will help your reader to call up an image of the region to serve as the story's setting. Even though these terms are nonspecific, your reader's schematic memories for stereotypical places will populate their mental simulation with specific imagery, called to mind from their memories. Call up a farmhouse, ghost town, or desert island, and you've just loaded a wealth of schematic setting information for your reader to visualize, which can make a story surprisingly spatially immersive with surprisingly few spatial details from the text. Even more schematically loaded are place names with specific and well-known schematic imagery. For almost everyone, city names like London, Paris, New York, and Tokyo will call up specific imagery like Big Ben or the Eiffel Tower, as well as less specific imagery like black cabs, yellow taxis, packed subway cars, and black-suited salarymen crossing crosswalks in droves. City sounds, smells, and other sights are likely to come along for the ride. The most schematically loaded places, of course, will be settings that readers have actually visited themselves, especially places they're intimately familiar with. One story I found particularly resonant for me because of this type of place association was Melanie Ray Thon's short story Xmas, Jamaica Plain, which is set in a Boston neighborhood I knew well when I read the story. I found it especially easy to picture the apartment that was the setting for the story because I'd been inside many apartments in JP over the years. As a result, I found that story extremely spatially immersive. Even if places are fictional, naming specific elements of the place, whether they be regions, landmarks, streets, etc., will give the reader a specific cognitive point around which to anchor their mental simulation. This will help in the reader building a more clearly delineated and therefore more immersive story world map. Borders. At the edge of regions, there are often borders. These make great cognitive reference points for readers, especially in an adventure or quest narrative. An excellent example of a regional boundary comes from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy. Perhaps the most clearly defined region is Mordor, which is so clearly delineated because of its borders, both natural and unnatural, as it's surrounded by a nearly impassable mountain range, and its entrance along the road is a massive, heavily guarded gate. Mordor is a much more clearly defined region than the other regions in the epic, as a character is either in or out of Mordor based on their relationship to these clear borders, which the other regions of the tale lack. Constructed boundaries can be fences, walls, doors, etc., and natural boundaries can be mountains, rivers, canyons, oceans, etc. Smaller spaces, such as buildings and rooms, are also bounded by borders like walls and doors which delineate in and out. Landmarks. Within regions, the best contextual spatial markers are landmarks. Landmarks are any fixed point on the story world's map that a reader can cognitively pinpoint. It could be a character's house, a building, a statue, or an actual landmark like the Statue of Liberty or Washington Monument. If a character could point to it on a map of their story world, it's a landmark, and landmarks are extremely useful in helping the reader to orient the story's characters in space. Pathways. Also useful for orienting characters on the story world map are pathways. A pathway is created in the story world whenever two landmarks are referenced. If there isn't any contextual information to help the reader understand the relative orientation of these 2 points, then the pathway is only theoretical. But pathways become much more concrete if the characters move between the two landmarks, even implicitly. Here's an example of characters implicitly walking down a path between two landmarks from Lauren Groff's short story Delicate Edible Birds. Here, a group of fleeing news reporters are abducted by a Nazi-sympathizing French farmer during World War II. Initially, they're eating dinner at the Frenchman's table in his farmhouse, which was described in detail before this happens. "I'm very sorry, but I'll have to keep all of you fine foreigners here until the Germans come, won't I? Prisoners. And who knows what they'll do when they find you?" "You can't do that," said Victor. "Oh, can't I?" said Nicolas. And it was not a question. "Now, boys," he said to his sons, "lock them in the barn." Then they moved, one by one, into the night, Lucci kissing the hand of the old woman in thanks for the meal. The barn was one of the buildings of stone, dark and chill, more a cellar than a barn. Inside was a great mass of hay and a mound of potatoes and one ugly old donkey that bit at Lucci when he tried to make friends. This pathway, I would say, is about 70% explicit, with both landmarks clearly delineated and movement between the 2 points directly cued. Though the reporter's entrance to the barn is left to the reader's imagination, it's still a strongly mapped literary space, even though there's no specific information presented that cues distance or direction of the pathway. Often, the existence of two clear landmarks and character movement from A to B is enough to stimulate a strong, specific sense of movement across the story world's landscape. I've found pathways to be an excellent way to invite spatial immersion in a story, especially early in the narrative. It's a subtle, psychological trick that figuratively invites the reader into the story world by physically moving the characters along a pathway that draws the reader into the story world space. Figures and grounds. At the smallest scale of story world environments, objects become figures and spaces become grounds. Okay, what does this mean? A figure is any object in the story world, fixed or movable, that can be located in a scene. It might be easiest to think of figures as objects in a room or in proximity of the characters in outdoor spaces. Things like tables and chairs, a tree or a lamppost, or the characters themselves. Figures need a space to exist on or in, and this space is called a ground. I haven't done any study of this, but my intuition is that many grounds in stories are simply implied. For example, if I mentioned a character moving from the kitchen table to the couch in the living room, my suspicion is that few authors would feel the need to mention the floor. It would just be implied. But it's certainly not out of the ordinary for a writer to mention a specific ground to help a reader form a clear image. Here's Humbert Humbert doing just that from a passage you may recall. "Lo, Lola, Lolita!" I hear myself crying from a doorway into the sun. In the middle of a trim-turfed surface, I found her at last. She had run out before I was ready. Oh, Lolita! There she was, playing with a damned dog, not me. I put a gentle hand to my chest as I surveyed the situation. In this case, the ground is the trim-turfed surface, and the figures are Lolita herself and the dog she's playing with. An added possibility for potential confusion is this. Depending on the frame, a figure can theoretically become a ground and vice versa. Take the following passage. Lindsay took the book off the coffee table and opened it to the page where she'd left off. Sitting between pages 149 and 150 was her bookmark, adorned with smiling blue-spotted ladybugs. She was almost halfway through her summer reading. Note in the first sentence how the initial ground is the coffee table and the figure is the book sitting on it. In the second sentence, the book itself has become the new ground where the bookmark, resting between two pages, has now become the figure. How figures and grounds shift isn't a particularly critical point, except to note that they do shift depending on the frame of reference. Grounds become figures and figures become grounds. Here's where the discussion of figures and grounds can help to smooth out the imagery in your stories. Stories are linear in that one word precedes another, and therefore when a reader is constructing an image, the figure must precede the ground or vice versa. It can be valuable to pay close attention to this process because of a phenomenon I'm going to call regrounding. Regrounding, on the whole, I think, can hurt the flow of a story, and it happens a lot in mediocre fiction. Suppose I were writing a story, and in it a character was cooking eggs. Observe the following example. Gina was standing by the stove cooking eggs for breakfast when Thomas came into the kitchen. The steam from the boiling water was glowing a dull orange from the rising sun creeping through the kitchen window. Gina liked her eggs poached. By no means is this a terrible passage in terms of cueing a spatial simulation. There are some decent spatial details that help to direct a reader to construct the scene. But were you at all surprised by the second sentence? Even though it cues a nice visual image of the orange-hued steam rising above the stove, unless you're one of the few people out there like Gina who likes your eggs poached, when I wrote cooking eggs in the first sentence, you probably pictured something different, like the figure of fried or scrambled eggs in the ground of a skillet. The eggs then must be regrounded from the skillet you probably envisioned at first to the pot that Gina was actually using. I certainly don't offer this as a hard and fast rule, but I think that unless you're trying to surprise your readers, you should strive to offer grounds before figures. Forming mental imagery is a difficult enough task to ask your readers to perform. If your prose frequently forces them to erase and modify the images they've already struggled to construct, it may push them out of the story. It may not even be something they, or you, ever notice explicitly. They'll likely notice that they're not as immersed in your story as they are in some other writer's stories, and they probably won't know why. Try to find ways to offer your reader the ground and then the figure so that they don't have to modify the sequence of images. Here's what that last passage might look like following a ground-figure sequence. Gina was standing by the stove when Thomas came into the kitchen. In a large steaming pot of boiling water, Gina was poaching eggs for breakfast. The steam from the boiling water was glowing a dull orange from the rising sun creeping through the kitchen window. Again, this is a very subtle difference that doesn't much alter the meaning of the passage. What it does do is make the sequence of imagery linear. The reader doesn't have to retrace their steps and reground. It's just a little smoother. I mentioned this phenomenon once before, way back at the beginning of these lessons. Remember Stephen King's Rabbit? If you recall his initial telepathic message, "Look, here's a table covered with a red cloth. On it is a cage the size of a small fish aquarium. In it is a rabbit with a pink nose and pink-rimmed eyes. In its front paws is a carrot stub, upon which it is contentedly munching. On its back, clearly marked in blue ink, is the numeral 8. I'd have to ask Stephen to see if he's consciously aware of it. But if you look at each sentence, it follows the pattern. Ground, figure, ground, figure, ground, figure. He offers a table, covered by a cloth. Then he places the cage on the table, then puts a rabbit in the cage, then puts pink eyes and a pink nose on that rabbit. And note in the final sentence, Stephen calls attention to the rabbit's back as a ground, then directs you to place the figure, the blue 8, on the ground he's already offered. There's zero chance of regrounding here. It's a smooth linear progression of imagery from the largest ground, the table, to the smallest figure, the blue numeral 8. This is one of the reasons Professor King is an all-time world bestseller. I strongly suspect he's aware that he works this way, but whether it's conscious or not, it's one of the reasons his prose is so smooth. Remember, ground, figure. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. From vast regions all the way down to the smallest figures and objects, the story world space is a crucial element to every story. Your dynamic story world can vary from vague and shadowy to explicitly delineated, depending on how explicit and clearly ordered your text's cues are. But here, we've only covered the range of story world space. Next, we'll look at how your readers develop a sense of place and construct a complete story world.